The following program is a Springer Podcast Network production.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Cody Springer Show, episode 141. And today's podcast is Why Men Need Friends. And, I got a few quick things to note here before we continue with the podcast. As you guys may have noticed, new microphone. This is the Fifine K688 microphone. And I like the quality thus far, and I hope you guys, can tell a difference, from, last week's podcast with the RGB mic, which is from the same brand and company, but yeah, this is the K688, which has been a, pretty, good microphone for a lot of creators and podcasters too, like myself, and it's definitely really, uh, been out there as a top choice for podcasters and streamers, content creators. And so going forward, this will be the microphone that will be used for the Cody Springer Show and other podcasts that I will have coming up in the future. So, yeah. So new microphone, and the podcast is now on Rumble. If you're familiar with the platform Rumble, the full episodes in video format will be on Rumble as well as YouTube and Facebook. So for podcasting purposes, for audio, you'll have Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and all your other preferred podcasting platforms. That's where the Cody Springer Show will continue to be on for audio, but for video, it will be on YouTube, Rumble, and Facebook. So you can go on those three platforms to watch the podcast, because video podcasting is growing, and I think it's important for podcasters to kind of stay current. I know a lot of people still listen to just audio, and that's great, no need to change that. No need to, go in that direction if you don't want to, if you're a fellow podcaster. But, I do think it's important to change with the times. And when this podcast began in 2018, it was just strictly audio. And then before I went on my hiatus, back in 2022, I was starting to take the podcast into video. But yeah, I'm just making the podcast more available and, to get more eyes on it. And, there's a part of the Springer Podcast Network that I'm trying to grow. So, we'll have this show, and then Pro Wrestling Focus will be back here, in the near future. So, you'll have two podcasts that you can, watch and listen to on the Springer Podcast Network. But yeah, I'm ready to run hard and ready to do this thing and grow my brand. So, but without any further ado, let's talk about the topic for this week's episode. And, I've had a lot of friendships throughout my life. Some were people I knew in person, some were people I met online. And looking back, most of these friendships ended because of some type of conflict it got me thinking about friendship in general and why it's something that men don't talk about enough. And this episode, just coming from personal reflection, and I may not be the best example when it comes to maintaining friendships. because I've made some mistakes and I've, um, done some things that might have caused these friendships to fall apart. But yeah, we're going to reflect on that and more here on this podcast. When we're kids, friendship happens naturally. Nobody teaches us how to maintain these friendships because we really don't have to. It's just something that happens organically. Because, when you start in preschool or daycare, when you're about 3 to 5 years old, making friends is easy, because it's kids around your age and, you play together and you have fun together. And then, when you start preschool, then, yeah, you start class with them, you go to lunch with them, you go to recess, and you start building up that friendship. And then, like, oh, that those are my buddies, yeah, we go to recess, we have fun, and then when you go home, you tell your mom and dad about your day and like, oh, I play with, Johnny or Chris or, whoever. And you just tell your kid, tell your parents you have the absolute best time, at school playing with your friends. And then at times, depending on the neighborhood you live in, there might be kids in the neighborhood that may not go to the same school with you, but they're in the neighborhood. And then, you meet them and then you play together and then become friends, because when I was in Van Wert, when I was living in Van Wert as a kid, we lived on Vine Street. And I met a kid in the same neighborhood that lived 2 houses down from us. And, man, I'm telling you, he and I were, like, really good friends at that time, and yeah, like, every day, almost every day, we would hang out. He would come down to my place or I'd go down to his place, and, he had a little his family had a little bit more than we did. They had a trampoline, they had a little basketball court, um, yeah, so they had a little bit more than what we did, but, it's fine. Some families are afforded more than, other families. It's just how it is. But yeah, man, I mean, but basically making friends as kids, it's pretty freaking easy, like there's no complication. I mean, because, there's no responsibilities really. There's really, nobody to answer to, you're not out here paying bills, there's no like real complications with anything. You're just a kid being a kid, and you're having fun and, you're just, living your kid life. So yeah, when we're kids, there is no real complication. But when we get older, that's when things kind of get more complicated because, we're starting to grow up. But some of these friends could be lifelong friends. You could be friends with somebody from the time that you guys are in preschool together to the time of your high school graduation. Sometimes, it just works out that way. And they do say that if you're friends with somebody for 7 years or more, that friendship is likely to be lifelong lasting. But yes, friendship definitely was easy when we were kids. Now, like I said, friendship was easy when we were kids. But when life starts happening, then that's when things kind of go to the wayside. You know, um, like I said, if you were friends with somebody from preschool or kindergarten up until high school graduation, that's when the friendship really gets tested. Because when you graduate high school, that's when life really starts happening because that is the first day of the rest of your life, honestly. Because, when you're 16 and everything, you're still kind of in that kid mindset, that teenager mindset. You're like, oh, I can't wait to graduate high school in a couple years. I can't wait to be done with school. And I was that teenager. I was like so done with high school and it's bullshit. I was like, man, I cannot wait to be done with high school. Fuck high school. I hated high school with a fucking passion, dude. I mean, I was just like so done with school, But the problem with me is I'm not a morning person. So me getting up early and going into school, yeah, I was not about that shit. I was just like, you know what? I cannot wait to be done with high school and, basically do whatever I want. But the reality is you can't really do whatever you want, because you got to figure out what you're going to do for a job and, career or if you're going to go to college or not. But yes, that's when it really starts is, you graduate high school, everyone has their own plan in life. Like, oh, I'm going to go to college and I'm going to study psychology. I'm going to get a 4-year degree in psychology and everything. Or somebody wants to join the military. So when they're done with high school, they enlist in the Marines. They go to the Marines or the Navy. Or, they want to, go into the workforce. So they go apply for a factory job. And now instead of going to school for 8 hours a day, they're working in a factory for 8 hours a day. And I'm like, yeah, they're making money. They're starting to, secure their own financial independence. But, it's kind of a different thing to be in. But yeah, and everyone kind of goes their own separate paths. And some of you might go to the same college, let's say you and your friend applied for I don't know, Penn State. Just throwing a random college out there. Let's say, your friend, he's gonna go study for his degree in business. He wants to do business administration. You want to pursue a degree in I don't know, sports science. Maybe you want to be a gym teacher or something like that. So you guys go to college and then you meet different people in college. So you start to form friendships in college. So then maybe that causes you to drift apart. You guys have this mindset like, oh, we're going to go to the same college and everything. We're basically just going to stick by each other no matter what. And then you guys meet different people. You guys get into different friend groups. Maybe you guys do, get into sororities and stuff like that. And yeah, and then you kind of just drift apart. Not meaning to, but you just get pulled in different directions. But yeah, I would say graduating high school is where most friendships kind of fall apart, because people just naturally just drift away from each other. And then, relationships, marriage, parenthood, those are also causes of why friendships might fall apart. Becoming a husband, becoming a father, you don't have that time to go just hang out with your friends and do whatever you want like you used to. If you get with somebody and, you get married to them and you want to start a family, then naturally, time with friends just kind of falls to the wayside. as depressing as that sounds, it does happen, because when I became a dad and a husband, I did not have all the time in the world to do whatever I wanted. I had responsibilities, and those responsibilities take away from free time, unfortunately. But at the same time, don't, let that example that I'm talking about take away from how important being married and being a parent, don't let it take away from that importance, because it's extremely important. It's more important than any friendship you could possibly have. But yeah, I mean, things change as life changes for you. And then, friendships can also change if someone moves away, which it happens. I had a friend who, I was friends with for quite a few years, and then when they decided to move to a different town, that's kind of when things changed a little bit, you know. But it happens. And then me podcasting, you know, um, that could also be another example too. If your life changes, then podcasting could also change as well. And I've talked about that with you guys, how I went on hiatus for 4 years to focus on my family and my marriage. I mean, the key takeaway, I think, is that a lot of friendships don't end because of fights or disagreements. They just end because, unfortunately, life gets pretty busy. Now, this is the part right here where I do think that, you need to talk about friendships falling apart because of arguments and disagreements and all that. Because from personal experience, I've had a lot of friendships fall apart because of arguments and misunderstandings and betrayal. And so, yeah, I mean, when you argue with a friend about something, it's mostly because you both think you're right. You both think that in this particular um, topic that you're both right. You both think like, oh no, I'm fucking right about this. And then your friend's like, no, fuck you, I'm right about this. So you guys argue and bitch and complain at each other. Like, no, dude, you're wrong. I'm right. Fuck you. I know that I'm right. And I think just a lot of pride gets in the way, because you want to prove to your friend that you are in the right and that they're in the wrong. And, a lot of the times, I would get in arguments with friends and then eventually, we would cool down and then we would come back and talk about it, like, okay, now that I thought about it, you know what, you're right, actually, you are right about this thing. I was just kind of stuck in my mindset, and when you weren't on board, I took it the wrong way. And there's no problem in admitting when you're wrong about shit. There isn't, because you're not going to be right all the time. There's going to come a time in your life when you're going to be wrong about something. And now some people are probably going to, be like, oh no, Cody, I'm right about everything. No, fuck you, you're not. You are going to be wrong about something. There's going to be something that you are wrong about. And yeah, and the fact that, some people can't come to grips that they're wrong about shit. Yeah, that just goes to show how, egotistical that they can be, So yeah, there is definitely nothing wrong with admitting faults. Everyone has their faults in life. Nobody's perfect. And if anyone claims to be perfect, then obviously they're just an egomaniac because, yeah, you're going to be wrong about something at some point in your life. And there could be a time where there's misunderstandings between you and a friend. Maybe you guys had plans one night, like, oh, hey, man, let's go hang out at the bar and play some pool, be there around 8 o'clock. And then maybe your friend understood you and thought you said 9 o'clock. That happens. There's misunderstandings, and then, here you are, at 8 o'clock, you show up, and then your friend ain't there, and then, you're just wandering around like, where the hell are they at? So you text them like, hey, man, I'm here. Are you coming? And he's like, what do you mean? I thought we were gonna meet up at 9 o'clock. So now you're annoyed because you said 8 o'clock and your friend thought 9 o'clock. So yeah, I mean, but there can be misunderstandings that happen sometimes, and it can be annoying, because you told that friend like, oh hey, fucking said 8 o'clock, dude. Where the fuck you at? And why did you think 9 o'clock? So I mean, yeah, I mean, misunderstandings definitely can definitely be blown out of proportion. And then it leads to a fight, an argument, disagreement about shit. So yeah, I mean, misunderstandings can definitely impact a friendship. And then there's betrayal, like I talked about last week with talking about the Randall situation and what he did to my other friend, Marcel, over that girl. That was definitely some, betrayal that happened there, and I talked about it, and how, Marcel liked that girl. Randall came in and he pretty much squashed it, wanted her for himself. And, we were getting to that point where, we thought we could work it out, and Randall just thought he did nothing wrong, which led to the friendship ending. So yeah, betrayal, yeah, it sucks, because you can be, friends with somebody for years, consider them like a brother or a sister, and they stab you in the back. I mean, it is definitely, a hurtful thing that can happen, and it's happened to me plenty of times. And then, another thing that can impact a friendship is just hurt feelings. Maybe, you forgot to wish your friend a happy birthday, or, there was something that they expected you to remember and you didn't remember, and now they're upset with you. So yeah, I mean, hurt feelings about that could impact a friendship, or maybe you made a joke or a comment that did not sit well with them, like, oh, maybe you're around a friend, and, maybe you made the comment like, oh yeah, you're a stupid fucker for doing that, just joking, just making it a playful joke. And, in the moment they're just kind of like, yeah, yeah. But then like later on, like, oh man, that kind of hurt my feelings a little bit, like I didn't like how they said that, but I think it's important that people communicate that to their friend. Like, oh, hey man, just so you know, when you made that a joke earlier, it kind of offended me, you know, I didn't really like it, because here's the thing. If you were my friend and I made a joke or a comment that offended you in any way, tell me, tell me about it, and I will be understanding, and I will be like, hey, I'm sorry. I did not mean any offense by it, yeah, I'm deeply sorry, I did not mean to offend you, but thank you for telling me so that way I don't make that same mistake in the future. And then pride. Pride is a big one, because, let's say you have a big falling out with somebody, like you guys had this huge fucking disagreement about something, pissed each other off to the max. And, there's a part of you that wants to forgive that person and get back on the right path with them, but your fucking pride gets in the way. And it happened to me before. I've let my pride get in the way of making amends with somebody. So, pride is a big issue with a lot of people. They just cannot seem to put their pride to the side, and admit that they were wrong about something. And then come to a solution with their friend and get over whatever it is that, is causing the problem. Pride is a huge issue with people. And then holding grudges is, the last big thing here. Holding grudges, like you can hold a grudge against somebody for years. I mean, let's take my mom and my aunt, for example. There was something that happened between them years ago. I don't know what it is. I've never asked, but basically, my mom and my aunt held a grudge against each other for years over something. I don't know what it was, but basically, they would not talk to each other, and then they would only be around each other for us kids, pretty much. But then eventually, in time, they were able to forgive each other and move on. But if you're holding a grudge against somebody, you eventually got to work past that and get over it. It's okay to be pissed off about in the moment, being pissed off at them, but eventually, in time, you have to get past it and get over it. But now that I'm saying this particular stuff, if I'm being honest, I can look back and see friendships that probably could have been saved if either side had communicated better. As far as questions to ask myself, was I too stubborn? Probably. I can be a stubborn son of a bitch at times. So maybe, I was being too damn stubborn and not wanting to see the other person's side. Did I expect too much from people? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I expected too much out of certain friends. If something came up, if I had made plans with friends to come over to my place or whatever, and then they were texting me or they called me and saying, hey, Cody, hey, I know I said I was going to come over today, but, hey man, something came up, I can't make it. And I would get a little shitty about it. I'm not going to lie, but I think that I took that the wrong way sometimes. I kind of was like, oh, they're just being fucking lazy and they just don't want to, come over for whatever reason. And that's probably not even what happened. It was they probably did have something legitimately going on and they couldn't get out of it. So I think I did expect too much. Did I give people enough grace? Was I patient enough? Absolutely not. I think the more bitter I became as a person, the more impatient that I became too. I would give people, grace at first, but then I would get tired of it, after a while, So I do think that I should have been more patient with people, and not, just jump to conclusions or get shitty and everything. And then the last question to ask myself, was I always willing to hear the other side? No. Honestly, no. Yeah, I mean, I think there were certain situations where I was absolutely in the right about things, but there was also times where I wasn't willing to hear the other person out. Get their perspective, try to understand what was going on with them in that particular moment. I was not always willing to hear the other person out. But again, I'm just reflecting, not blaming. I'm not blaming myself. I'm not blaming the other person. I'm just reflecting on past experiences that I had. So yeah, I was stubborn. I expected too much. I became impatient, and I wasn't always willing to hear the other person out. I can honestly take that look at myself in the mirror and be honest about those things. All right, so let's talk about online friendships for a moment, and you guys can make fun of me here if you want. But in my opinion, I think online friendships are just as real as real friendships. And you guys can make fun of me for that if you want to. I don't care. But during my podcasting journey, I got connected with several people. And I can honestly say that, some of these people were my friends at one point. Like when I was part of the 7X wrestling show, I met Lucas Rojas. He was in New York. I was in Ohio at the time. And, we both were passionate wrestling fans. And then we grew to know each other and, talk about more personal stuff. But yeah, Lucas, if you're out there listening, bro, I hope you're doing well. I know you've had nothing to do with me for years and everything, but I hope you're doing well. And then, I met Keith Zuccarelli, from the K&A podcast, the K&A show. Keith and I, we talked a lot. And then one day I stopped hearing from Keith altogether. I'm not sure why. But Keith, if you're out there, hope you're doing good, man. Hope you're doing good. And then there's a guy from Australia that I talk to every so often. His name is Sean. And Sean and I, we do talk here and there still, not as much as we used to, but, we're still friendly with each other. It's like, Sean's like one of those people where you don't talk to them for a long time. And then all of a sudden you start talking to them again. And it's like you guys never stop talking to each other. It's weird, man. But Sean, Sean's a great person, a great guy. And yeah, I when we do talk, I enjoy it. So yeah, Sean, yeah, if you're out, if you're listening to this, man, I do enjoy our talks from time to time, man. But some people dismiss online friendships, but some of the deepest conversations I've ever had were with people that I met through the internet. And I think online friendships are more common now than they ever were before, especially with COVID, because COVID changed a lot about people's lives, people being in lockdown and isolation, you couldn't really go out and do much, you had to wear a mask. So like, yeah, socialization was pretty much like dead, at times during COVID. So there's probably people out there getting on Reddit or wherever and making connections online, and to be honest, I think there's nothing wrong with having friendships that are online, that you met through people online. Now, you do have to be careful, out there because there are a lot of weirdos on the internet, a lot of creeps. So you do have to watch out. You do have to protect yourself online, and everything. You still have to do all that. You just can't openly trust anybody. But yeah, I mean, there's people that you meet through podcasting and social media, gaming communities, like if you game, and you play online and you meet people that way, you can really bond with somebody, having the same thing in common. You play a specific video game with each other, like Call of Duty or something like that, or Fortnite, which I don't play Fortnite. But yeah, the point is that online friendships can become meaningful, just like real life friendships, but they can end just as painfully as well, you know. But yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with having online friends. I think there are a lot of men out there, and they could be listening right now to this podcast, and they haven't had a real conversation with a friend in months. And, a lot of men don't like to talk about the loneliness that they feel. Because men, they keep a lot of things to themselves. They don't always reach out. And there's a lot of guys out there who are married like me and have a family, but still feel isolated. Like they still feel lonely. And, I do think it's important to have those conversations. I really do, because, men out there, yeah, like I said, they keep things to themselves. They keep things bottled up inside. And unfortunately, their mental health takes a hit. And then suddenly, you hear that they passed away because they, took their own life, and it's so sad, to, hear that. And, you just think to yourself, like, what if they reached out to someone? What if they had somebody that they could reach out to, like a friend, or a coworker that they're, friendly with, like somebody that they could talk to, that did not make them feel how they feel inside. Because there's this perception out there about men, that men have to be strong, they have to be the alphas in their family, and they have to be the providers and everything, and and that men aren't allowed to be sad or upset about things. Fuck all that noise. Fuck that. Because men feel just as much as women do. It's just we don't talk about it. Because I think society has conditioned us to not talk about how we feel. We've been conditioned to just keep things to ourselves, and, because we have to be strong for our families. We have to be strong for our wife, be strong for our kids, we have to be strong for everybody. We have to put on a face for everybody. We have to appear strong, And I think, we need to start changing that. I think men need to start reaching out to people. They need to start talking more. They need to talk more about how they feel. And then, for men who do have a wife at home or even a husband, we don't judge on this podcast. You got to start listening more. I mean, women, women come home and talk about their days with us and everything, and we listen, and, we're that person that they can talk to. But I think it needs to go both ways. Men need to talk about their day. They need to talk about how they're feeling inside. If they're feeling depressed, they need to talk about why they're depressed. They need to talk about the loneliness. They need to talk about it. And I felt this way myself. Even though I have a wife, even though I have a son, there's been times where I felt lonely. You know, for whatever reason, you just feel that way. And I think it's because, we don't have somebody that we can talk to, that we can reach out to and say, hey, man, I really need to talk to somebody. Do you have 15 minutes? Do you have 20 minutes? Can we meet up somewhere? Can we meet at, go meet up for a drink and just talk about shit? Guys are going through this time where they just feel like nobody wants to be their friend, pretty much, that they don't give a shit about them. And I think it's about time that men start being more honest and open with themselves. And they just need to start discussing it instead of keeping things inside. And if people want to be judgmental and everything, fucking let them. Who gives a fuck what they think? Because they're not in your shoes. They don't know how you feel. So, yeah. I think it's time that we start having real conversations about how us men are feeling in our own heads. So, what have I learned in my life when it comes to friendships? Nobody's perfect. Like I talked about earlier, there's people out there that think they're absolutely perfect, that they don't do anything wrong, but in reality, they do. Every day. You are going to make a mistake somewhere in your life. Nobody is perfect. And then every disagreement doesn't have to end a friendship. You can agree to disagree on things, how people get in like the stupidest little arguments, like, oh, yeah, my sports team is better than your sports team. And then you're like, no, they're not. And then you guys get into a fucking stupid argument about it. Like, who cares? You agree to disagree. But yeah, every disagreement doesn't have to end a friendship. And then sometimes friendships just naturally run their course. There are just certain people that you cannot keep in your life. For whatever reason, the friendship ends. Maybe they're moving on to a different point in their life. Maybe they're going to school, maybe they're moving away, maybe they're moving to North Carolina or Florida or somewhere far away from you. And then things just run its course, and it sucks, don't get me wrong, but, or there's a friend that you got along with really well, but then they got really toxic and then you didn't realize this in the beginning. But now you're like, oh my God, I did not realize how toxic this person really was. And then you have to basically cut them out of your life. That's basically another example of a friendship running its course. And then sometimes pride gets in the way, whether it was my personal pride or somebody else's pride. Sometimes pride does get in the way of friendship, and I think you got to find it within yourself to let go of the pride. And then the last thing I learned is that communication matters. Yeah, communication is the key thing that ruins a lot of friendships because, if you have that misunderstanding, about something that can lead to an argument, which can lead to a fight happening, which leads to the friendship falling apart. So yeah, clear, concise communication, understanding that they understand and that you both are on the same page. But the key thing here is that you don't have to agree on everything to remain friends, because there's going to be something that you two absolutely disagree on, and I think this has been more prevalent with like politics, and I'm not going to get into a big political discussion here. That's not what I do on my podcast, but some people are Democrats, some people are Republicans, and now they can't stand each other, and then it leads to friendships falling apart, like you're not going to agree on every little thing. But if you care about that person enough, you're going to get the fuck over it. Pure and simple. Like, I do not agree with you on this, but I understand. And just leave it at that. And that is being the mature adult thing. That's doing the mature adult thing. So, my final reflection here is, I'm not making this podcast episode because I've mastered friendship. Because hell no, I haven't. I'm making this podcast because I've struggled with it. And my hope is for, to help you guys with your friendships as well, because I've struggled with a lot of mine. So here's my challenge to anybody that's watching or listening to this podcast right now. Reach out to an old friend of yours, whether it's on Facebook or texting them, making a phone call, reconnecting, because, maybe, they would love to hear from you, like, oh, I haven't heard from so-and-so in a long time. I would like to talk to them, just say, hey, like, hey, I saw you online on Facebook, how you doing? How's life treating you? Just make that step to reconnect with somebody, cause you never know what could happen, cause that could be, the choice that, maybe it's someone who you were cool with in school, but you weren't like a close friend. And then you guys become close friends out of it. Who knows, man? But yeah, that's my challenge to everybody that's, listening or watching this podcast, is to make that text, make that phone call, reconnect. Because life moves fast. We get older, our priorities change, and people drift apart. But sometimes all it takes is one conversation to rebuild a bridge that you thought was gone forever. All right, guys, that will be all for today. Thank you for supporting the Cody Springer Show, the Springer Podcast Network, and I will talk to you all very soon.